New Orleans, 1918. The Great War was grinding to its bloody conclusion across the Atlantic, but in the steamy streets of the Crescent City, a different kind of terror was taking root. A terror that would transform the vibrant city into a landscape of fear, suspicion, and dread. The city itself was a character in this horrifying tale, a place of contradictions where Catholic piety coexisted with voodoo rituals, where the refined French Quarter stood in contrast to the working-class neighborhoods where Italian immigrants had made their homes. These immigrants had come seeking opportunity in America, many opening small grocery stores that became the centers of their communities. They could not have known that their pursuit of the American dream would make them targets for one of the most elusive killers in American history. It began on a warm night in May 1918, when the still night air was pierced by the sounds of terror. What followed was a series of brutal attacks that shocked the city to its core. Families attacked in their beds, doors forced open without any signs of conventional breaking and entering, odd clues left behind, and a peculiar detail that became the killer's signature, an axe belonging to the victims used against them in the dead of night. The police would search fruitlessly. Theories would multiply. Supernatural explanations would gain traction among a populace increasingly desperate for answers. And through it all, the killer would continue his reign of terror, seemingly untouchable, disappearing into the night like a phantom after each brutal attack. This is the story of those dark days in New Orleans, when the Axeman walked the streets, selecting his victims, entering their homes, and bringing down his terrible weapon on innocent sleeping victims. It is a story of blood and terror, of investigation and frustration, of a city under siege from an enemy who seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. On the evening of May 22, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggio closed their small grocery store on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets. The day had been hot and humid, typical for late spring in New Orleans. Joseph counted the day's earnings, a modest sum that represented honest work. His brother, Andrew, who lived with them, had already retired to his room in their shared living quarters behind the store. The Maggios were part of the large Italian-American community that had established itself in New Orleans. Like many of their countrymen, they had opened a grocery store, a common business venture for Italian immigrants who found that such establishments required relatively little capital to start and served as both livelihood and connection to the community. The couple went through their nightly routine, unaware that these were their final hours. Joseph locked the doors, checked the windows, and eventually the couple retired to their bed. The night was still. No one in the neighborhood reported hearing anything unusual. It was Andrew Maggio who discovered the scene that would become the first chapter in the bloody saga of the Axeman. Rising early, as was his custom, he found the door to his brother's room partially open. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. Joseph and Catherine Maggio lay in their bed, their bodies soaked in blood. Joseph's throat had been cut so deeply that his head was nearly severed from his body. Catherine had suffered similar wounds. The brutality of the attack was shocking, even in a city that was no stranger to violence. The New Orleans Police Department officers who responded to Andrew's frantic call immediately noticed peculiar details about the crime scene. The couple's bedroom had been accessed through a panel in the rear door that had been chiseled away, creating a hole just large enough for a man to reach through and unlock the door from inside. On the floor beside the bed lay the murder weapon, an axe belonging to the Maggios themselves, which had been stored in the yard. The killer had not just entered the home and committed murder, he had done so with premeditation, bringing a chisel to gain entry, then using the victim's own axe against them. Adding another disturbing element to the crime, the killer had used a straight razor, also belonging to Joseph Maggio, to slice the victims' throats after the axe attack. News of the brutal murders spread quickly through the city. Italian grocers, in particular, felt a chill of fear. The method of entry, the chiseled panel, was specific and unusual. The use of the victim's own tools as weapons added an intimate, violating quality to the crime that struck terror into the hearts of residents. The police initially suspected Andrew Maggio. It was a natural conclusion. He was in the house at the time of the murders, claimed to have heard nothing, and there were no signs of robbery. However, Andrew's genuine shock and grief soon convinced investigators that he could not have been responsible for the savage attack on his brother and sister-in-law. Detective John D'Antonio, one of the first officers assigned to the case, carefully examined the scene. The precision of the entry method, the brutality of the attack, and the strange choice to use the victim's own tools all pointed to something more complex than a simple robbery or crime of passion. D'Antonio had worked New Orleans streets long enough to recognize that this was something different, something that carried the potential for repetition. This killer took his time, D'Antonio noted in his initial report. He was methodical, patient, he didn't rush, even with another man sleeping just rooms away. That suggests confidence, planning, and a disturbing level of comfort with extreme violence. The investigation proceeded along conventional lines at first. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, looking for witnesses who might have seen someone lurking near the Maggio grocery store in the days leading up to the murder. They questioned known criminals in the area, particularly those with records of breaking and entering or violent offenses. They examined the financial records of the Maggios, looking for any evidence of debt or illegal activities that might have made them targets. None of these inquiries yielded results. The Maggios were, by all accounts, a hard-working couple with no enemies. Their grocery store was modestly successful, but not wealthy enough to make them obvious targets for robbery. And yet they had been selected, their home invaded, and their lives taken with shocking brutality. What the police could not know then was that this was merely the beginning. The method of entry, the chiseled panel, would become a signature, a calling card that would link this crime to others. The use of the victim's own axe would become a pattern, and the targeting of Italian grocers would emerge as a chilling preference of a killer who was just getting started. For now, though, the murder of Joseph and Catherine Maggio remained an isolated incident, a shocking crime that disturbed the city, but did not yet suggest the emergence of a serial predator. That understanding would come later, after more blood had been spilled and more families had been destroyed by the nocturnal visits of the man who would come to be known as the Axeman of New Orleans. The funeral for the Maggios was attended by much of the Italian community. As their coffins were lowered into the ground at St. Louis Cemetery, Andrew Maggio stood alone, his face a mask of grief and incomprehension. Among the mourners, perhaps, stood the killer himself, watching the consequences of his actions, already planning his next attack. The city returned to its routines, the murder gradually fading from the front pages as other news took precedence. But in the Italian neighborhoods, doors were checked twice before bedtime, and many shopkeepers invested in firearms. There was a sense, unspoken but pervasive, that something had changed in New Orleans, that a darkness had entered the city and might soon return with bloody intent. They did not have long to wait. The brutal murder of the Maggios had barely faded from the city's consciousness when just over a month later, the darkness returned. On June 27, 1918, another Italian grocery store became the site of horrific violence. Louis Bessumer and his companion, Harriet Lowe, operated a grocery at the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe streets. Like the Maggios, they lived in the quarters behind their modest establishment. The neighborhood was quiet, populated largely by working-class families who knew each other well. Nothing about the Bessumer grocery store marked it as a likely target for violence. In the early hours of that June morning, while the city slept through another sultry summer night, an intruder entered the Bessumer residence. Again, the method of entry showed planning and patience. A panel chiseled from a rear door, creating just enough space for a hand to reach through and unlock the door from inside. The attacker moved silently through the house, found an axe on the premises, and entered the bedroom where Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe slept. With terrible efficiency, the intruder brought the axe down on the sleeping couple. Bessumer was struck in the head, the blow crushing part of his skull. Lowe received similar treatment, the blade of the axe cleaving into her head above her ear. Unlike the Maggios, however, Bessumer and Lowe survived the initial attack. Despite catastrophic injuries, both victims clung to life. Louis Bessumer, blood streaming from his head wound, managed to stagger outside where he was discovered by a neighbor, John Zanka, who had come to the store early to buy bread. The police and ambulance were quickly summoned. The scene they found mirrored aspects of the Maggio case in disturbing ways: the chiseled panel, the use of the victim's own axe, the brutality of the attack, and the targeting of an Italian grocer. Detective D'Antonio, arriving at the scene, immediately recognized the similarities. "It's the same man," he told his superiors. "The method is too specific to be coincidence." Both victims were rushed to Charity Hospital in critical condition. The prognosis was grim, particularly for Harriet Lowe, whose skull had been deeply penetrated by the axe blade. Louis Bessumer, though severely injured, was conscious enough to be interviewed briefly by police. "I saw nothing," he managed to say. "I was asleep, and then there was pain. I cannot tell you who would do this." As the victims fought for their lives in hospital beds, the investigation took on new urgency. The New Orleans Police Department now had to consider that a predator was at large in the city, one who targeted specific types of victims and attacked with extreme violence. The city newspapers, which had relegated the Maggio case to the inside pages as the weeks passed, now brought the story back to the front page. The Times-Picayune ran a headline that sent shivers through the city. "Axeman strikes again. Second Italian grocer attacked in home." The use of the term Axeman was the first time the killer had been given a specific moniker, but it would not be the last. The name caught on quickly, spreading through the city in whispered conversations and nervous speculation. As with the Maggio case, the investigation revealed little. No witnesses came forward who had seen anyone suspicious near the Bessumer grocery. No fingerprints were found on the axe or at the points of entry. The only physical evidence was a blood-smeared chisel discovered near the scene, presumably the tool used to remove the door panel. While the police investigation continued without clear direction, a strange twist occurred in the Bessumer case. Harriet Lowe, drifting in and out of consciousness in her hospital bed, made a startling accusation. She claimed that Louis Bessumer was a German spy who had secret papers hidden in the grocery store. This was 1918, with America fully engaged in World War I, and anti-German sentiment was at its height. The accusation, though coming from a severely injured woman, likely suffering from trauma and delirium, was taken seriously. Police searched the Bessumer grocery and found letters written in what they believed might be code. Louis Bessumer, still recovering from his own injuries, found himself under suspicion not just as a possible victim of the Axeman, but as a potential enemy agent. He explained that the letters were written in his native Yiddish and contained nothing more sinister than correspondence with family members. Eventually, the spy allegations were dismissed, but not before adding another layer of confusion and sensation to the already mysterious case. Harriet Lowe's condition worsened in the hospital. Infection set in around her head wound, and despite the efforts of doctors, she died on August 5th, over a month after the attack. Her death converted the case from assault to murder, intensifying the police investigation and public fear. The death of Harriet Lowe marked a grim milestone. She was now officially the third victim of the Axeman. The city's Italian community, already on edge after the Maggio murders, now began taking extraordinary precautions. Many grocery store owners hired night watchmen or took turns keeping vigil. Others moved their sleeping quarters away from their businesses, believing that the Axeman specifically targeted those who lived behind their stores. Yet despite these precautions, the shadow of fear continued to deepen across New Orleans. The mysterious nature of the attacks, the lack of clear motive, and the seeming ability of the killer to enter homes without detection created an atmosphere of dread that affected the entire city. And then, before the city could fully process the death of Harriet Lowe, the Axeman struck again. The pattern was continuing, and the night terrors of New Orleans were just beginning. August 5th, 1918. The same day that Harriet Lowe succumbed to her injuries in Charity Hospital, marking the transformation of the Bessumer case from assault to murder, another attack occurred that confirmed the worst fears of New Orleans residents. A predator was systematically targeting the city's inhabitants. This time, the victim was Mrs. Anna Schneider, a pregnant woman in her 8th month. She lived with her husband, Ed Schneider, at 4339 Elysian Fields Avenue. Unlike the previous victims, the Schneiders were not grocers, nor were they Italian Americans. This departure from the pattern added a new dimension of fear to the city. If the Axeman was no longer limiting his attacks to Italian grocers, then anyone could be a potential victim. Ed Schneider worked nights as a bartender, leaving his pregnant wife alone in their home. On this particular night, Anna Schneider went to bed around 10:30 p.m., securing the house as best she could. The night was hot, and like many homes in New Orleans at that time, the Schneider residence had no air conditioning. Windows were left partially open to catch any breeze that might provide relief from the oppressive August heat. Sometime after midnight, Anna Schneider was awakened by a presence in her bedroom. Before she could fully register what was happening, she was struck on the head with a heavy object. Despite the blow, she remained conscious and saw a dark figure standing over her bed. The intruder struck her several more times before she lost consciousness. The attack on Anna Schneider differed from the previous incidents in several ways. The assailant had entered through a window rather than chiseling a door panel. Instead of an axe, the weapon appeared to be a heavy lamp that had been in the living room of the Schneider home. And unlike the Magios and Basumers, Anna Schneider was not attacked alongside a partner, but was alone in the house. Yet there were similarities, too, that suggested the same perpetrator. The attack occurred while the victim was sleeping. The intruder had moved through the house with enough confidence to locate a suitable weapon. And there was no obvious motive like robbery. Nothing of value was taken from the Schneider home. Ed Schneider returned from work in the early morning hours to find his wife unconscious, the house in disarray, and blood soaking the bedroom. He immediately called for police and medical assistance. Anna Schneider was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save both her and her unborn child. Remarkably, Anna Schneider survived the attack. Even more miraculously, she delivered a healthy baby boy just days later, despite her injuries. When she was able to speak to investigators, she could provide only the vaguest description of her attacker. A large man, she thought, though she had seen little more than a shadowy figure in the darkness of her bedroom. The attack on Anna Schneider sent a new wave of panic through New Orleans. The Axeman, as the newspapers were now consistently calling the attacker, was no longer following a predictable pattern. If he was willing to attack a pregnant woman who was neither Italian nor a grocer, then his selection criteria remained a terrifying mystery. Detective D'Antonio, who had been investigating since the Maggio murders, was troubled by the Schneider case. It both fit and didn't fit the emerging pattern of the Axeman attacks. Either we're dealing with the same man who is expanding his range of victims, he noted in his case files, or we have a copycat who has been inspired by the newspaper accounts of the previous attacks. The city police increased patrols in residential neighborhoods. Hardware stores reported selling out of locks, bolts, and other security devices as residents frantically attempted to secure their homes against intrusion. Gun sales soared as citizens sought to protect themselves from the nocturnal predator. But the increased vigilance and security measures would prove insufficient. Before the end of the month, the Axeman would strike again, and this time with a particularly brazen attack that demonstrated his confidence and seeming imperviousness to capture. On August 10th, just 5 days after the attack on Anna Schneider, Joseph Romano, an elderly man of Italian descent, was attacked in his home on Tonti Street. Romano lived with his two nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno. The sisters heard strange noises in their uncle's room around 2:30 a.m. and went to investigate. As they approached his room, they saw a man fleeing through the window. Entering the room, they found their uncle grievously wounded, his head split open by axe blows. Despite immediate medical attention, Joseph Romano died 2 days later from his injuries. The Bruno sisters provided the first real description of the Axeman, though it was limited by the darkness and their shock at discovering their injured uncle. They described a dark-complexioned man of average height, solidly built, wearing a dark suit and a slouched hat. This vague description did little to narrow down the search for the perpetrator, but it confirmed what many had suspected. The Axeman was a physically imposing man capable of overpowering his victims quickly. The attack on Romano fit the earlier pattern in several ways. An Italian victim, entry gained stealthily at night, an axe used as the murder weapon. But there was a new element of boldness. The Axeman had struck despite the presence of other people in the home, and he had fled when discovered rather than attacking the witnesses. This growing boldness troubled investigators. It suggested a killer who was becoming more confident with each attack, perhaps even enjoying the notoriety that was building around his crimes. The newspapers were now full of speculation about the Axeman's identity and motives. Some suggested he was a madman with a grudge against Italians. Others proposed more outlandish theories that he was a supernatural entity, a demonic presence, or even a vengeful spirit. In the wake of the Romano murder, the Italian community in New Orleans began keeping vigils, with armed men standing watch outside homes and businesses. The city police established special patrols in Italian neighborhoods. The entire city held its breath, waiting for the next attack. But then, something unexpected happened. The attacks stopped. August gave way to September, and September to October, with no new incidents attributed to the Axeman. The city remained on edge, but as the weeks passed without another attack, some began to hope that perhaps the killer had moved on, or been captured for some other crime, or even died. This period of quiet would not last. The Axeman was not finished with New Orleans. He was merely biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike again and reignite the terror that had gripped the city during that bloody summer of 1918. March 13, 1919. 7 months had passed since the murder of Joseph Romano, and the city of New Orleans had cautiously begun to return to normal. The Axeman had not been forgotten. Indeed, his reign of terror had become part of the city's lore, a dark chapter that residents recounted in hushed tones. But the immediate fear had begun to recede as the months passed without incident. Then came the letter. On that March morning, the offices of the Times-Picayune received an envelope addressed simply to editor. Inside was a letter that would reignite the terror and add a bizarre new dimension to the Axeman saga. The letter purported to be from the Axeman himself. The newspaper's editor, after reading the contents, immediately contacted the police. Detective D'Antonio and his colleagues rushed to the Times-Picayune offices to examine the letter firsthand. What they read chilled them to the bone. The letter began with a startling claim. Hell, March 13, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. The writer identified himself as the Axeman and proceeded to taunt the police for their inability to catch him. But it was what came next that transformed the letter from a mere taunt to something far more sinister. The writer claimed to be a demon from hell, a supernatural entity beyond the reach of mortal authorities. I am not a human being, the letter proclaimed, but a spirit and a fell demon from the hottest hell. This supernatural claim might have been dismissed as the ravings of a madman, except for what followed, a specific threat that demanded immediate attention. The Axeman announced his intention to visit New Orleans again on the night of March 19th, the following Tuesday. I am very fond of jazz music, the letter continued, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. The letter went on to say that anyone playing jazz music in their home on that night would be spared, but those who did not would get the axe. It was signed simply, the Axeman. The Times-Picayune published the letter in its entirety the next day, adding to the growing hysteria in the city. The police could not dismiss the threat, given the writer's apparent knowledge of details that had not been widely published. Whether the letter was genuinely from the killer or from someone claiming to be him, it represented a clear threat to public safety. The response from the citizens of New Orleans was unprecedented. As March 19th approached, jazz music became not just entertainment, but a survival strategy. Those who owned phonographs, still a relative luxury in 1919, equipped themselves with jazz records. Those who could play instruments prepared to perform on the fateful night. Those who could afford to do so hired jazz bands to play in their homes. On the night of March 19th, New Orleans became a city of music. From grand homes in the Garden District to humble shotgun houses in working-class neighborhoods, jazz poured from open windows. Dance halls and saloons were packed with people seeking safety in numbers and in music. Even those who had previously condemned jazz as immoral or disreputable embraced it as protection against the threatened violence. The jazz orchestras of New Orleans had never been in such demand. Every musician who could hold an instrument was employed that night, playing from dusk until dawn. The city became a cacophony of sound, a defiant musical response to the threat that hung over it. One establishment, the Kolb's restaurant in the French Quarter, advertised a special event for the evening. Open all night. Jazz band begins at midnight. The Axemen won't get you here. Other venues followed suit, turning a night of potential terror into something approaching a citywide party, albeit one born of fear. Detective D'Antonio and his colleagues did not rely solely on Jazz for protection. The entire police force was mobilized that night, with officers patrolling the streets in unprecedented numbers. Special attention was given to Italian neighborhoods and to homes where no music was playing. Households that, whether through choice or necessity, were not heeding the Axemen's musical demand. The night of March 19th passed without incident. No attacks were reported, no homes invaded, no sleeping victims awakened by the terrible presence of the Axemen. Whether deterred by the music, the increased police presence, or simply biding his time, the threatened killer did not appear. The morning of March 20th saw a city exhausted but relieved. The music had stopped, the bands had gone home, and the immediate threat appeared to have passed. But the respite would be brief. The Axeman had not made an appearance on his announced night of return, but that did not mean he had abandoned his deadly intentions. Just days later, on March 22, 1919, the terror resumed in earnest. The target this time was a small grocery store owned by an Italian immigrant named Orlando Giordano on the corner of Carrollton Avenue and Hickory Street. Inside the store lived the Cortimiglia family, Orlando's tenants and employees. Rosie Cortimiglia, her husband Charles, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary were asleep when the intruder entered through a back door panel that had been chiseled away, the same method used in the Maggio and Bessumer attacks. The Axeman had returned to his original pattern. The family was awakened by the sounds of an intruder. Charles Cortimiglia confronted the man, but was immediately struck down with an axe, receiving severe head wounds. Rosie grabbed their daughter and tried to shield her, but the attacker brought the axe down on both of them. The blows fractured Rosie's skull in several places. Little Mary, still in her mother's arms, received a fatal wound to her head. The commotion alerted neighbors, and the Axemen fled into the night. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Despite the severity of their injuries, both parents survived. Their daughter did not. The murder of a child added a new level of horror to the Axemen's crimes. The city, which had just begun to recover from the tension of March 19th, was plunged back into terror. The brief hope that the letter to the newspaper might have been a hoax, or that the Axemen had somehow been satisfied by the city's musical response, was shattered. In her grief and pain, Rosie Cortimiglia made a shocking accusation. She claimed that the attack had been carried out by her landlord, Orlando Giordano, and his son, Frank. The police acted on this accusation, arresting both men despite their protestations of innocence. The case against the Giordanos was weak from the start. Orlando was in his mid-60s and in poor health, making it unlikely that he could have carried out the physically demanding attack. Frank had several witnesses who placed him elsewhere at the time of the crime. Moreover, the attack bore all the hallmarks of the previous Axeman incidents, which had begun before the Cortimiglias had any contact with the Giordanos. Despite these inconsistencies, the Giordanos were charged with the murder of Mary Cortimiglia and the attempted murder of her parents. The arrests provided a sense of closure for a terrified public, eager to believe that the Axeman had been identified and captured. But many, including Detective D'Antonio, remained skeptical. The Axeman case was far from closed. The arrest and charging of the Giordanos created a false sense of security in New Orleans. Many citizens, desperate to believe that the Axeman had been caught, accepted the police department's version of events without question. Others, more skeptical, noted the similarities between the Cortimiglia attack and the previous Axeman incidents, similarities that were difficult to explain if the Giordanos were indeed the culprits. Detective D'Antonio was among the skeptics. He continued his investigation, convinced that the real Axeman remained at large. His concerns would be validated all too soon. On August 10, 1919, nearly 5 months after the Cortimiglia attack, and with the Giordanos still awaiting trial, another axe murder occurred. This time, the victim was Steve Bocca, an Italian grocer who operated a small store on Elysian Fields Avenue. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. Bocca was attacked while sleeping, his skull fractured by axe blows. The assailant had gained entry by removing a panel from the back door, the same method used in several previous Axeman attacks. Once again, nothing was stolen, ruling out robbery as a motive. Boca survived the attack, but could provide no description of his assailant. He had been asleep when the first blow fell and remembered nothing until he regained consciousness in the hospital. The attack on Boca raised serious questions about the Giordano's guilt. If they were indeed the Axemen, how could these identical attacks be continuing while they were in custody? The Boca attack was followed by another on September 3, 1919. The victim this time was Sarah Lawman, a young woman who lived alone in a small cottage on 2nd Street. Like Boca, Lawman was attacked while sleeping and suffered severe head injuries from an axe. The intruder had entered through a window, leaving behind the axe, which belonged to Lawman, on the front lawn. Lawman survived her injuries but, like so many of the Axeman's victims, could provide no useful description of her attacker. She had been unconscious from the first blow and saw nothing of the man who had so brutally assaulted her. With 2 new attacks occurring while the accused Axeman suspects were in custody, the case against the Giordanos began to unravel. Public opinion, which had initially supported the arrests, now shifted. Many began to call for the release of the Giordanos and a renewed investigation into the identity of the true Axeman. The pressure increased when, on October 27, 1919, Mike Pepitone became the Axeman's next victim. Pepitone, another Italian grocer, was killed in his bedroom while his wife Esther slept beside him. Esther Pepitone awoke to find a large man standing over her husband's body, axe in hand. The killer fled when she screamed, disappearing into the night before neighbors could respond. Esther Pepitone provided the most detailed description of the Axeman to date. She described him as a heavy-set, dark man, well-dressed in a dark suit and hat, about 6 feet tall. This description matched what the Bruno sisters had glimpsed after the attack on their uncle, Joseph Romano, over a year earlier. The Pepitone murder was particularly significant because it occurred in a different part of New Orleans than most of the previous attacks. The Axeman was expanding his territory, striking in neighborhoods that had previously felt safe from his reign of terror. With the Axeman clearly still active while the Giordanos remained in custody, the case against them collapsed. In a dramatic reversal, Rosie Cortimiglia recanted her accusation, admitting that she had falsely accused the Giordanos under pressure from the police, who were desperate to show progress in the case. The Giordanos were released after spending nearly a year in jail for crimes they did not commit. The vindication of the Giordanos returned the city to square one in the Axeman investigation. All the previous theories and speculations resurfaced. Some believed the killer was targeting Italians specifically, possibly as part of a vendetta or extortion scheme. Others thought he might be a deranged individual with a pathological hatred for grocers or small business owners. The supernatural theories also gained new life. The letter to the Times-Picayune, with its claim that the writer was a demon from hell, had planted a seed in the public imagination. In a city with deep roots in voodoo and other mystical traditions, the idea of a supernatural Axeman found fertile ground. One particularly persistent theory held that the Axeman was connected to the Black Hand, a criminal organization that extorted money from Italian immigrants through threats and violence. According to this theory, the axe murders were punishment for those who had refused to pay for protection. However, no evidence of extortion demands preceding the attacks was ever found. As 1919 drew to a close, the city of New Orleans remained in the shadow of the Axeman. The attacks had created a climate of fear that affected every aspect of daily life. Residents barricaded their doors and windows at night. Many slept with weapons nearby. The simple act of going to bed had become an exercise in fear management for many New Orleanians. The police, meanwhile, were no closer to identifying or capturing the killer than they had been after the first attack on the Magios in May 1918. Despite an unprecedented investigation that included door-to-door interviews, surveillance of potential targets, and the examination of countless leads, the Axeman remained a phantom, striking at will and disappearing without trace. The last confirmed attack attributed to the Axeman was the murder of Mike Pepitone in October 1919. After that, the killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The city remained on alert for months, waiting for the next attack, but it never came. Various theories have been proposed to explain the abrupt end to the Axeman's reign of terror. Some believe he may have died or been imprisoned for an unrelated crime. Others suggest he moved to another city to continue his killing spree under a different modus operandi. Still others believe he simply stopped killing, perhaps satisfied with the fear he had created, or perhaps having fulfilled whatever twisted purpose drove him to murder. The truth may never be known. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of America's most mysterious serial killers, his identity concealed by time and by the limitations of early 20th century forensic science. What is known is the impact he had on a city, transforming New Orleans for nearly 2 years into a place where darkness brought not rest but terror, where locked doors provided no security, and where the simple sound of jazz music could, for one night at least, represent the difference between life and death. The New Orleans Police Department's investigation into the Axeman killings was hampered from the beginning by the limitations of forensic science in the early 20th century. Fingerprint analysis, though known, was not yet widely applied in criminal investigations. DNA analysis lay decades in the future. Investigators relied primarily on witness testimony, physical evidence visible to the naked eye, and the methodical collection of information through interviews and neighborhood canvassing. Detective John D'Antonio, who had been involved with the case since the Maggio murders, led the investigation. A veteran officer with extensive experience in New Orleans' complex social landscape, D'Antonio brought a methodical approach to the case. He recognized early on that these were not typical murders motivated by robbery, passion, or personal vendetta. The lack of theft, the specific targeting of victims in their sleep, and the consistent methodology suggested something more complex. D'Antonio's initial approach focused on potential connections between the victims. Were there business relationships, personal conflicts, or other ties that might explain why these specific individuals had been targeted? The predominance of Italian grocers among the victims seemed significant, suggesting some form of targeted campaign against this specific community. The investigation explored several theories. First was the Black Hand theory. The Black Hand was an extortion racket that targeted Italian immigrants in many American cities, including New Orleans. Victims would receive threatening letters marked with a black handprint, demanding money in exchange for protection. Those who refused to pay often became victims of violence. The systematic targeting of Italian grocers seemed consistent with Black Hand operations, but there were inconsistencies. No Black Hand letters had been received by any of the victims prior to the attacks. The violence employed, axe murders in the victims' beds, was extreme even by Black Hand standards, which typically involved beatings, property damage, or targeted shootings. Detective D'Antonio interviewed numerous members of the Italian community seeking information about Black Hand activities in the city. These interviews yielded little concrete evidence connecting the murders to organized crime. Most individuals were reluctant to speak openly about the Black Hand, fearing reprisals, but those who did speak suggested that the attacks did not bear the hallmarks of the organization's methods. "The Black Hand wants money," one Italian businessman told D'Antonio confidentially. "They don't kill people in their sleep for no reason. They warn them first, demand payment. These attacks, there's something else entirely." The second major theory explored was that of a personal vendetta against Italians. Anti-Italian sentiment was not uncommon in early 20th century America, and New Orleans had a history of it. In 1891, the city had been the site of one of the largest mass lynchings in American history, when 11 Italian men were killed by a mob after being acquitted of the murder of police chief David Hennessy. This event had created lasting tensions between the Italian community and other New Orleans residents. D'Antonio investigated whether the Axeman might be motivated by ethnic hatred, perhaps even connected to someone affected by the earlier conflicts. This theory gained some support from the predominance of Italian victims, but it too had inconsistencies. Not all of the Axeman's victims were Italian. Anna Schneider and Sarah Laumann, for instance, had no Italian heritage. Moreover, if ethnic hatred was the motive, there were far easier ways to target Italians than breaking into individual homes at night. The third major investigative direction involved examining similar crimes in other cities. D'Antonio corresponded with police departments across the country, seeking information about comparable attacks. This line of inquiry yielded some interesting connections. Between 1911 and 1919, a series of axe murders had occurred in Texas and Louisiana that bore striking similarities to the New Orleans attacks. In San Antonio, Texas in 1911 to 1912, several families had been attacked in their sleep by an axe-wielding intruder who gained entry through back doors or windows. In Rain, Louisiana, similar attacks had occurred in 1911. In Lake Charles, Lafayette, and Crowley, Louisiana, axe murders had been reported between 1911 and 1912. These earlier crimes shared many characteristics with the New Orleans attacks. The victims were attacked in their sleep, the doors had been chiseled or panels removed for entry, and the assailant used axes found on the premises. The pattern suggested the possibility that the Axeman had been active for years before turning his attention to New Orleans. However, a confounding factor emerged. A man named Joseph Mumphrey, also known as Frank Mumphrey, had been arrested for some of the earlier Texas attacks and had served time in prison until 1918, just before the New Orleans Axeman killings began. This timing was suggestive, but no direct evidence linked Mumphrey to the New Orleans crimes. As the investigation continued through 1918 and into 1919, D'Antonio and his colleagues interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, tracked down countless leads, and investigated dozens of suspects. Each new attack provided additional evidence, but also new questions. The bizarre letter to the Times-Picayune in March 1919, purportedly from the Axeman himself, added another dimension to the investigation. Handwriting analysis was in its infancy as a forensic technique, but experts examined the letter for distinctive characteristics that might be matched to known individuals. The paper and ink were common varieties available throughout the city, providing no useful forensic information. The content of the letter, with its supernatural claims and musical ultimatum, suggested to some investigators that the killer might be mentally unstable, perhaps suffering from delusions of grandeur or supernatural power. Psychiatric professionals were consulted, though their ability to develop a profile of the killer based on the limited information available was constrained by the primitive state of forensic psychology at the time. The night of March 19, 1919, when the Axeman had threatened to strike but didn't, provided no new clues but demonstrated the killer's power over the city. Whether he had been deterred by the music and increased police presence, or had simply been toying with the city all along, the Axeman had succeeded in creating mass hysteria with nothing more than a letter. The false arrest and eventual release of the Giordanos in connection with the Cortimiglia attack represented a significant setback for the investigation. Not only had valuable time and resources been wasted pursuing innocent men, but public confidence in the police department's handling of the case was severely damaged. The revelation that Rosie Cortimiglia had been pressured into making a false accusation raised questions about the investigative methods being employed. After the attack on Mike Pepitone in October 1919, what would prove to be the final confirmed Axeman attack, the investigation entered a new phase. With no new incidents to investigate, D'Antonio and his team revisited all the previous cases, looking for connections or details that might have been overlooked. They re-interviewed survivors and witnesses, hoping that time and distance from the traumatic events might have clarified memories or revealed previously forgotten details. One aspect of the investigation that received renewed attention was the method of entry used in many of the attacks. The removal of a door panel, creating just enough space for a hand to reach through and unlock the door from inside, suggested someone with knowledge of breaking and entering techniques. This led investigators to examine records of burglars and home invaders known to operate in New Orleans, particularly those with violent tendencies. The investigation also focused on individuals with medical or anatomical knowledge. The precision of the axe blows, targeting the skulls of sleeping victims in a way that was often fatal but sometimes survivable, suggested to some investigators that the killer might have some understanding of human anatomy. Doctors, medical students, butchers, and others with such knowledge were investigated, though this line of inquiry produced no definitive suspects. As 1919 gave way to 1920 and the attacks ceased, the active investigation gradually wound down. Detective D'Antonio never officially closed the case, continuing to follow up on leads as they emerged, even as he was assigned to other investigations. He maintained a detailed file on the Axeman that he consulted periodically throughout the remainder of his career, hoping for the breakthrough that never came. In the years that followed, various individuals confessed to being the Axeman, but none could provide details that weren't already public knowledge, and all were eventually dismissed as attention seekers or mentally disturbed individuals fixated on the notorious case. The investigation of the Axeman murders represents one of the most challenging and ultimately frustrating chapters in American criminal history. Despite the efforts of dedicated investigators like D'Antonio, the limitations of early 20th century forensic techniques, combined with the killer's methodical approach and apparent randomness in victim selection, created an investigative puzzle that remained unsolved. Modern criminologists reviewing the case have suggested that with contemporary forensic techniques, DNA analysis, advanced fingerprinting, psychological profiling, geographic profiling, the Axeman might have been identified. But in the New Orleans of 1918 to 1919, even the most diligent investigation could not penetrate the darkness that concealed the identity of one of America's first documented serial killers. In the years since the Axeman's reign of terror ended, numerous theories have emerged about his identity. Some of these theories were developed during the original investigation. Others arose in subsequent decades as criminologists, historians, and amateur sleuths re-examined the case with the benefit of hindsight and modern understanding of serial killer psychology. Among the most enduring theories is the immigrant theory. This posits that the Axeman was targeting Italian immigrants specifically, either out of ethnic hatred or due to some personal grievance against the community. The predominance of Italian victims, particularly grocers, lends some credence to this theory. However, it fails to account for non-Italian victims like Anna Schneider and Sarah Laumann. A variation of this theory suggests that the Axeman was himself Italian, perhaps involved in some form of vendetta or seeking to eliminate business competitors. This theory points to the killer's apparent familiarity with the layout of Italian grocery stores and living quarters, suggesting insider knowledge of the community. The Black Hand theory remained popular for many years, despite the lack of extortion letters preceding the attacks. According to this theory, the Axeman was an enforcer for the Black Hand organization, punishing those who had refused to pay for protection. The absence of extortion demands has been explained by proponents of this theory as indicating that the victims already knew why they were being targeted. They had previously refused Black Hand demands. Joseph Mumphrey, or Mumphrey, emerged as a significant suspect in later years. As mentioned previously, Mumphrey had been imprisoned for similar crimes in Texas until 1918, coinciding with the start of the New Orleans attacks. Adding to the circumstantial case against him, Mumphrey was shot and killed in Los Angeles in 1921 by Esther Pepitone, the widow of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman's last known victim. According to newspaper accounts from the time, Esther Pepitone claimed to have recognized Mumphrey as the man she had seen standing over her husband's body on the night of the murder. She had tracked him to California and taken revenge. Some researchers view this as strong evidence implicating Mumphrey as the Axeman, suggesting that Esther had identified her husband's killer and delivered the justice that the legal system had failed to provide. However, there are inconsistencies in the Mumphrey theory as well. Records connecting him to the earlier Texas axe murders are incomplete and sometimes contradictory. His physical description does not perfectly match the limited eyewitness accounts of the Axeman, and the circumstances of his death at Esther Pepitone's hands have been questioned by some researchers, who suggest the confrontation may have been related to organized crime activities rather than vengeance for Mike Pepitone's murder. Another theory that gained some traction involves the jazz connection. The Axeman's letter to the Times-Picayune expressed a fondness for jazz music and offered to spare those playing jazz on the night of March 19, 1919. Some researchers have suggested that the killer might have been connected to the jazz scene in New Orleans, perhaps a musician or venue owner seeking to promote the genre through notoriety. This theory, while creative, lacks substantive evidence and fails to explain the specific targeting of victims or the pattern of the attacks. The occult theory arose partly from the Axeman's letter claiming supernatural origins. Some New Orleans residents at the time believed the killer was a practitioner of black magic or voodoo, using the murders as part of some arcane ritual. The theatrical nature of the Times-Picayune letter, with its references to hell and demons, seemed consistent with someone deeply involved in occult practices or beliefs. Modern criminologists have applied contemporary understanding of serial killer psychology to the case, developing profiles that suggest the Axeman was likely a sociopathic individual who derived satisfaction from the terror he created. The methodical nature of the attacks, the lack of sexual assault or robbery, and the apparent enjoyment of public attention, as evidenced by the letter, are consistent with a killer motivated by psychological gratification rather than practical gain. Geographic profiling of the attacks suggests that the killer likely lived in or was very familiar with central New Orleans, particularly the areas with high concentrations of Italian immigrants. The attacks formed a rough cluster, with the killer rarely venturing into unfamiliar neighborhoods, a pattern often seen in serial killers who operate in areas where they feel comfortable and in control. One theory that has gained support among modern researchers is that the Axeman may have had a personal connection to one or more of his victims. This could explain the specific targeting of certain individuals and the apparent randomness of others, the latter possibly chosen as cover crimes to obscure the true target. However, no clear connections between the various victims have ever been established beyond their predominant Italian heritage and occupation as grocers. A particularly intriguing suspect emerged decades after the killings. In the 1970s, crime writer Colin Wilson suggested that a man named Joseph John Davila might have been the Axeman. Davila had been arrested in December 1919 for attacking a woman with a knife while dressed in a dark suit and slouch hat, similar to descriptions of the Axeman. He was committed to an asylum for the criminally insane, and the Axeman attacks ceased around this time. However, records connecting Davila to the Axeman murders are circumstantial at best, and no definitive link has been established. The most mundane but perhaps most likely explanation is that the Axeman was an otherwise unremarkable individual whose identity has been lost to history. He may have died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply moved away from New Orleans, taking his deadly secrets with him. Without a confession or definitive physical evidence linking a specific individual to the crimes, the true identity of the Axeman may never be known. What is certain is that the Axeman case represents an early example of a serial killer operating in America, predating the term serial killer itself by many decades. The methodical nature of the attacks, the apparent lack of traditional criminal motive, and the psychological cat-and-mouse game played with the public through the Times-Picayune letter all foreshadowed elements that would become familiar in later serial killer cases throughout the 20th century. The Axeman's identity remains one of criminology's enduring mysteries, a shadow that still falls across New Orleans more than a century later. In the absence of definitive answers, the theories and speculation continue, ensuring that the Axeman retains his place in the dark pantheon of American criminal history. After the attack on Mike Pepitone in October 1919, the Axeman seemingly vanished from New Orleans. The city remained tense for months, waiting for the next attack that never came. Gradually, the immediate fear began to subside, though the impact of the Axeman's reign of terror would linger in the city's collective memory for generations. For the survivors of the attacks, the aftermath brought ongoing physical and psychological challenges. Louis Bessumer never fully recovered from his head wound and reportedly suffered from headaches and memory problems for the remainder of his life. Anna Schneider, though she delivered a healthy child despite her injuries, was said to have developed a pathological fear of the dark that persisted for years. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia, having lost their daughter Mary to the Axeman, separated after Rosie's false accusation of the Jordanos came to light. The guilt of sending innocent men to prison, combined with the grief over their daughter's death, proved too much for their marriage to withstand. The Giordano family, vindicated after nearly a year of wrongful imprisonment, struggled to rebuild their lives and reputations. Though legally exonerated, Orlando and Frank Giordano faced lingering suspicion from some quarters. The grocery store that had been their livelihood suffered during their imprisonment, and they eventually sold the business and moved to another part of New Orleans. For the Italian community as a whole, the Axeman attacks reinforced their sense of vulnerability in American society. Already subject to discrimination and stereotyping, Italian immigrants saw in the Axeman killings and in the eager willingness of some to blame the crimes on Italian organized crime another manifestation of the challenges they faced in their adopted country. The New Orleans Police Department's failure to identify and capture the Axeman damaged public confidence in law enforcement. Despite the dedicated efforts of detectives like D'Antonio, the department was criticized for its handling of the investigation, particularly after the wrongful arrest of the Giordanos. This erosion of trust would take years to repair. On a more positive note, the Axeman case led to improvements in home security throughout New Orleans. Hardware stores reported sustained increases in sales of locks, bolts, and other security devices long after the killings stopped. Many homes were modified to eliminate the design vulnerability that the Axeman had exploited, the removable panels in doors that had allowed him to reach inside and unlock entrances. The case also advanced the development of forensic investigation techniques in Louisiana. Though primitive by modern standards, the methodical collection and analysis of evidence in the Axeman case represented a step toward more scientific criminal investigation. The limitations encountered by investigators helped make the case for increased investment in forensic capabilities. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the Axeman is his place in New Orleans folklore and culture. The killer quickly became part of the city's dark mythology, a boogeyman whose story was whispered to misbehaving children and recounted in hushed tones during late-night gatherings. The supernatural elements of the case, particularly the letter to the Times-Picayune with its demonic claims, resonated in a city with deep traditions of voodoo, Catholicism, and spiritual belief. The jazz connection ensured that the Axeman would be forever linked to one of New Orleans' greatest cultural contributions to the world. The night of March 19, 1919, when the entire city played jazz to ward off the killer, has become a legendary event in the history of the music. Some music historians suggest that this night played a small but meaningful role in bringing jazz to audiences who might otherwise have dismissed it, helping to mainstream what was still considered by many to be disreputable music. In the decades following the killings, the Axeman became a staple of New Orleans ghost tours and true crime narratives. Books, articles, and later documentaries and podcasts have revisited the case, ensuring that each new generation of New Orleanians and true crime enthusiasts learns about the mysterious killer who terrorized the city in 1918-1919. The story of the Axeman has also influenced popular culture beyond New Orleans. The third season of the television series American Horror Story, subtitled Coven and set in New Orleans, featured a fictionalized version of the Axeman as a character. The killer has appeared in numerous novels, short stories, and other fictional works, his mysterious identity and methods providing fertile ground for creative interpretation. From a criminological perspective, the Axeman case is significant as one of the earliest well-documented serial killer cases in American history. Though the term serial killer would not be coined until decades later, the Axeman exhibited many of the characteristics now associated with such criminals. A methodical approach, a lack of conventional motive like robbery or personal vendetta, a pattern of similar crimes spaced over time, and a seeming psychological gratification derived from both the killings themselves and the public terror they generated. The case has become a staple in criminology courses and textbooks, offering students an early example of the challenges involved in investigating crimes committed by what we would now call a serial offender. The Axeman's ability to enter homes undetected, commit his crimes, and disappear without leaving useful evidence demonstrates the unique investigative difficulties presented by killers who choose victims with whom they have no discernible connection. For modern residents of New Orleans, the Axeman represents a dark chapter in their city's rich history. The sites of the attacks have mostly been rebuilt or repurposed over the centuries since the killings, but locals can still point out the locations where the Axeman struck. Some claim that these places remain haunted by the victims, their restless spirits unable to find peace due to the lack of justice and closure in their cases. The ultimate fate of the Axeman himself remains unknown. If Joseph Mumfree was indeed the killer, then his death at the hands of Esther Pepitone in 1921 brought a form of rough justice to the case. If, as many researchers believe, Mumfree was not the Axeman, then the killer may have lived out his life without ever facing consequences for his crimes. One theory holds that the Axeman may have continued his killing spree in other cities, perhaps changing his methods to avoid connection to the New Orleans crimes. Without modern forensic techniques like DNA analysis and comprehensive national crime databases, it would have been relatively easy for a killer in the early 20th century to move to a new location and begin again, leaving his previous identity behind. Another possibility is that the Axeman was imprisoned for an unrelated crime, perhaps dying in custody without ever being connected to the New Orleans murders. The incomplete nature of early criminal records makes it difficult to track individuals across different jurisdictions and time periods, leaving open the possibility that the Axeman's true identity is buried in some long-forgotten arrest record or prison file. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Axeman simply stopped killing for reasons known only to himself, living out a seemingly normal life in New Orleans or elsewhere, carrying his deadly secrets to the grave. This scenario, common in cases of uncaught serial killers, suggests that the Axeman may have lived among his former victims' communities, perhaps even participating in discussions about the very crimes he had committed. Whatever his ultimate fate, the Axeman of New Orleans has secured his place in the dark pantheon of American crime history. More than a century after his reign of terror, his identity remains a mystery, his motives unclear, and his crimes a chilling reminder of the capacity for human evil. In a city known for its celebrations of life, its music, food, and vibrant culture, the Axeman represents the shadow side, a memento mori in a place otherwise devoted to living well and fully. New Orleans has survived hurricanes, floods, epidemics, and economic hardships throughout its long history. It survived the Axeman too, absorbing the trauma of his crimes into its complex identity, transforming fear into folklore, and ultimately demonstrating the resilience that has become one of the city's defining characteristics. The Axeman may remain an unsolved mystery, but the spirit of New Orleans, like the jazz music that once kept the killer at bay, plays on. What do you think happened to the Axeman? Share your theories in the comments. And if you found this video gripping, give it a like. More unsolved case breakdowns coming soon, so subscribe to stay updated.